She stole my backyard for a wedding I never agreed to. I smiled and let her finish every last decoration. Then I called the excavator company. My neighbors thought I'd lost my mind. 6 months earlier, none of us saw this coming. By the time the truck rolled in, it was too late for her. What she didn't know would destroy her HOA career. And I filmed every single second of it. My name is Dana Marsh, 34, a landscape architect who'd spent 3 years turning a half-acre of scrubby lot behind my house into something worth photographing. I lived alone with my dog, Biscuit, in Cedar Hollow Estates, a quiet subdivision outside Charlotte where I'd bought in specifically because the lots were big enough for a garden nobody could complain about. My sister Callie was getting married that October, and I'd offered my backyard as the venue, string lights, a stone patio I'd laid myself, an arbor I'd built from reclaimed cedar. It was going to be small, quiet, ours. I never imagined the HOA president would decide otherwise. Cedar Hollow's HOA was run by Patricia Vance, a woman everyone called Karen behind her back long before it became a meme, because she'd earned it fair and square. Patricia had been president for 11 years, and in that time she'd find a man for a garden gnome, forced a widow to repaint her shutters twice, and once measured a neighbor's grass with a ruler. I'd mostly stayed under her radar. My landscaping was tasteful, my mailbox regulation height, my trash cans hidden exactly as bylaws demanded. I paid dues on time and skipped meetings. I thought that made me safe. Patricia had simply not found a reason to notice me yet. The trouble started with an email. Patricia wanted to beautify common spaces by hosting the neighborhood's fall social in a backyard with what she called photogenic bones. She'd toured several properties. She wrote, and mine had been selected. I read it twice, certain it was a joke. It wasn't. I replied politely that my yard wasn't available, that I had personal plans for it in the fall. Patricia responded within the hour, CCNG the entire board, insisting community events took priority under an obscure clause about shared aesthetic contribution. I'd never heard of that clause. Neither, turned out, had the board. I let it go. I thrive on friction. And I didn't have energy to spare. I was buried in Callie's wedding planning, coordinating caterers and dress fittings from 3 states away since Callie lived in Ohio and was flying everyone in. My yard was our anchor point. I needed it calm. 2 weeks later, Patricia showed up unannounced with a clipboard and a measuring wheel, walking my lawn like she owned it. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was assessing suitability and mentioned, almost casually, that HOA bylaws technically classified my rear lot as a shared visual easement. I looked up shared visual easement that night. It wasn't a real legal term, not one that existed in any HOA document I could find, and I'd read our covenants front to back when I bought the house. I filed the conversation away as strange, unsettling, but not yet something to fight over. Callie called that weekend giddy, describing the exact shade of blush she wanted for the tablecloths. I didn't mention Patricia. My sister had been through enough. 2 broken engagements, a canceled venue the year before, and I wasn't going to hand her one more thing to worry about before her big day. My neighbor Renata, 2 doors down, warned me over the fence one evening. She did this to the Ostrowskis, she said, voice low like Patricia might hear from 3 houses away. Took over their driveway for a fundraiser. They ended up moving. I laughed it off. Surely nobody could actually take a yard. Renata didn't laugh with me. She just shook her head and said, "Get everything in writing, Dana. Everything." I didn't understand yet how much that single piece of advice would matter. At the time, it felt like small-town paranoia. Later, I'd wish I'd started recording every conversation from day one. Patricia's next move came through the official HOA newsletter, a full page announcing the Cedar Hollow Fall Community Wedding Showcase. To be hosted, it said, generously, at the Marsh residence. My name, in print, attached to an event I'd never agreed to host, sent to every mailbox in the neighborhood. I called her immediately, unbothered, as if I should be thrilled. Think of the exposure for your landscaping business, Dana, she said. Everyone will see what you've built back there. I told her, flatly, no. She laughed a little and said, we'll sort out logistics soon. Don't worry. I sent a formal written objection that night. Certified mail. Keeping a copy for myself, Renata's advice finally sinking in. I stated clearly I had not authorized any event on my property and expected the newsletter retracted. Patricia never replied to the letter. She replied, instead, with silence and a smile at the mailbox. 3 days later, I found survey stakes in my backyard. Little orange flags marking out what looked suspiciously like a ceremony aisle, right where Callie's arbor was supposed to stand. No permission asked. No notice given. Someone had walked onto my land with tools and started planning a party I hadn't approved. I pulled every stake out myself, threw them in the garage, and texted Patricia a photo with one line, "Stay off my property." She didn't respond that night. I told myself the message had been clear enough, that a woman with 11 years of experience running an HOA understood a boundary when she saw one. She didn't understand it at all. Patricia showed up the following Saturday morning with 2 board members and a folding table, informing me, on my own porch, that the showcase committee had voted to proceed regardless, citing overwhelming community interest she'd apparently generated entirely on her own. I asked to see the vote. In due course. I asked which bylaw authorized entering private property without consent. She said the language was under legal review. Every answer was smoke, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never once been forced to actually prove herself right. That's when I learned who the wedding was for, not some neutral community showcase at all, but Patricia's own niece, Brooke, who couldn't afford a real venue and whose aunt had apparently decided my backyard would do nicely instead. The community event framing was cover. This had been personal and specific from the start. I felt something shift in me, cold and clear. This wasn't confusion or bureaucratic overreach anymore. Patricia had targeted my property, dressed it up as neighborhood spirit, and planned to hand it to her niece for free while erasing my sister's actual wedding from the calendar entirely. I would not simply let that happen. I called a real estate attorney that Monday, a woman named Priya Nair who specialized in HOA disputes. She read my covenants in 20 minutes and told me flatly there was no such thing as a shared visual easement anywhere in the document. Patricia had invented the term out of nothing at all. Priya suggested I document everything before confronting Patricia again. Photos, emails, timestamps, anything showing intent and pattern. People like this usually have a history, she said. Find it. I thought of Renata's mention of the Ostrowskis and their driveway. I started asking around the neighborhood, quietly, carefully, for old stories. What I found unsettled me more than I expected. At least 4 families had similar tales. Properties volunteered for HOA functions. Resistance met with fines or threats. Most people simply giving in because fighting felt exhausting. Patricia had built an 11-year reign on exactly that exhaustion, betting nobody would push back hard enough. I decided I would be the one who pushed back. I began recording every interaction, saving every email, timestamping every stake I pulled from my lawn. I told nobody except Priya and Renata. If Patricia thought she was dealing with someone who'd fold quietly, I intended to let her keep thinking that. Callie called with cake samples and I still said nothing, though it cost me. My sister deserved to celebrate without knowing her venue was under siege by a woman obsessed with control. I promised myself the wedding would happen exactly as planned. In that yard. On that day. No matter what it took. Patricia escalated through the HOA's official channel, mailing me a notice of community obligation, citing fictitious clause 14.3, demanding I cooperate with the approved showcase, or face a fine of $500 per week of noncompliance. I forwarded it straight to Priya, who laughed out loud reading it over the phone. There is no clause 14.3, Priya said. Your covenants stop at section 12. Patricia had fabricated an entire numbered provision, betting correctly that most homeowners never actually read the full document and would simply assume the board knew what it was talking about. It was audacious. Legally, nothing at all. I wrote back to the HOA board directly, not just Patricia, laying out in plain language that clause 14.3 did not exist and requesting the board president provide the actual bylaw being invoked. 2 board members quietly emailed me back, separately, saying they'd never voted on any showcase and hadn't seen a real agenda. That was the first crack. Proof the vote Patricia claimed had authorized this was, at minimum, exaggerated, and possibly entirely fictional. I saved both emails. Priya said if this went to a hearing, board members contradicting the president's own paperwork would matter enormously. I started to feel, for the first time, hopeful. Patricia wasn't finished. She began appearing at my house at odd hours, checking on preparations, walking the yard with Brooke and a wedding planner she'd apparently hired using HOA funds. I watched from my kitchen window as strangers measured my patio for a ceremony that existed nowhere in any legitimate paperwork. I confronted them on the lawn, calm on the outside, shaking on the inside. Brooke looked embarrassed, muttering something about Aunt Pat handling logistics. The wedding planner looked confused when I mentioned I owned the property and had never signed a contract. Patricia simply talked over all of us. Louder. Faster. Sure. That night I called Callie and finally told her everything. She went quiet, then furious, then oddly calm. Let her keep planning, Callie said. Let her spend money. Then we take it back at the worst possible moment for her. My sister, turned out, had her own instincts for war. We decided together, that night, on the strategy that would define the rest of the fall. Let Patricia believe she'd won completely. Let her invite guests, order flowers, book a photographer, hang lights. Let the illusion grow as large and public as possible. Then dismantle it, publicly, at the moment it mattered most. I hung up feeling something close to peace for the first time in weeks. Patricia had shown me exactly the kind of person she was, someone who mistook silence for surrender. I intended to give her plenty of silence. What she did with it would be the very thing that finally exposed her. I stopped objecting publicly. I let Patricia believe her campaign of pressure had worn me down, that I'd quietly accepted defeat rather than fight a woman with 11 years of institutional muscle behind her. She practically glowed with satisfaction at the next mailbox encounter, telling me how reasonable I'd finally become. Behind the scenes, Priya filed a formal complaint with the HOA's state-level regulatory body, documenting the fabricated bylaw, the unauthorized property entry, and the pattern of similar incidents I'd gathered from neighbors. These complaints move slowly, Priya warned, but they create a paper trail no board can later pretend didn't exist. Meanwhile, Brooke's wedding planning ballooned. Patricia commandeered the HOA's community fund for a beautification initiative, which somehow translated into professional lighting rigs, a rented dance floor, and a caterer contracted for 80 guests, all staged in a backyard she still did not have legal permission to use. I let the surveyors return. I let the caterer walk my patio measuring outlets. I even let Patricia's contractor install a temporary electrical hookup near my shed, smiling the whole time while Priya quietly filed photographs of every unauthorized modification as additional evidence of trespass and unlawful use of private property. Renata started feeding me information too, having overheard Patricia bragging at a book club meeting about finally putting that landscaper in her place. Apparently Patricia believed my silence meant total victory, and she'd begun telling people the showcase was practically a done deal. My resistance a footnote already forgotten. Callie flew in for a dress fitting and insisted on seeing the yard herself. Standing where her actual wedding was supposed to happen, now dotted with survey flags and extension cords for someone else's event, she went quiet for a long moment before saying, "This is going to feel so good to undo." We started building our own file in parallel to Priya's legal one, a folder of screenshots, invoices Patricia had approved using the community fund without board sign-off, photos of unauthorized construction on my land, timestamps proving every single step of an operation being run entirely outside any legitimate authority. One evening, I found a receipt blown into my flower bed, a rental invoice for a photo booth, paid from the HOA account, signed only by Patricia. No second signature, no board approval line filled in, despite our covenants requiring 2 signatures for any expenditure above $200. Another crack. I photographed the receipt exactly where it lay, then quietly slipped it into a folder before the wind could take it back. Priya said single signature expenditures over the limit, if pervasive, could constitute a serious breach of fiduciary duty, the kind of language that makes HOA boards very nervous very quickly. Patricia, oblivious, kept expanding. She sent an email, accidentally CC'ing me along with the rest of the board, bragging that once people see how beautiful it looks, nobody will care whose yard it technically is. I read that line 4 times. It was, in its own way, a confession. I forwarded it to Priya within the minute. Technically is, Priya repeated on the phone, half laughing, half stunned. She just admitted in writing that she knows it isn't hers. We agreed not to respond, not to tip our hand, to let that email sit quietly among the growing pile of proof. Brooke, meanwhile, seemed increasingly uneasy whenever we crossed paths. She mentioned once, almost apologetically, that her fiancé Tyler had asked several times whose property this actually was, and had gotten no clear answer from Patricia beyond, "Don't worry about it. I've got it handled." Tyler seemed worried anyway. I started to feel something unexpected toward Brooke. Not the anger I held for Patricia, but a strange, cautious sympathy. She hadn't asked for any of this. Her aunt had simply decided to hand her a wedding built on someone else's land. And Brooke, 26 and trusting, had taken the gift without asking questions. Patricia scheduled a walkthrough with the caterer for a Tuesday afternoon, and I made sure to be pleasant, offering lemonade, answering questions about outlet placement as though I were genuinely invested in making the day perfect. Every smile I gave cost me something. Every smile bought us another week of evidence. The board, meanwhile, had begun quietly fracturing. Two members who'd told me they'd never voted on the showcase started asking Patricia pointed questions at meetings, according to Renata, who'd started attending purely to gather intelligence.
Patricia deflected each question with the same tired line.
I asked Priya what would happen if we simply confronted Patricia with everything now, before the wedding, and ended it quietly. Priya said we could, but a quiet resolution would let Patricia save face, keep her position, and likely target someone else within the year. Callie and I agreed. Quiet wasn't enough anymore. We wanted more than a cease and desist. We wanted the truth in front of everyone who'd watched Patricia operate unchecked for over a decade. Every fine gnome, every repainted shutter, every family who'd moved rather than fight. This wedding, ironically, had become our best chance to finally make that visible. October crept closer. Date. The exact Saturday Callie's wedding had been planned for since spring, a fact Patricia surely knew and had simply chosen to override, confident nobody would connect two identical dates on the same property as anything but coincidence, or care if they did. Callie's actual guest list, quietly, had been rerouted to a backup plan we'd been building without Patricia's knowledge. A private hall 20 minutes away, on standby, deposit paid, decorations ready to move at a moment's notice. If the day came down to it, Callie would still have her wedding. Just not there. I told Priya about the backup venue, and she nodded slowly. "Good," she said. "Because it means we don't need this to go perfectly. We can be patient. Are into this as she wants." Patience, turned out, was the sharpest tool either of us had. Patricia sent invitations, actual printed invitations, on cardstock, with my address listed as the venue, no mention of me anywhere on them. My name, again, absent from the paperwork of my own backyard, exactly as it had been from the newsletter months before. Erasure, was simply how she operated. Renata got one of the invitations from a mutual friend and brought it straight to me. Seeing my own address printed on someone else's wedding invitation, glossy and confident, sent a jolt through me that no email or receipt had managed. This wasn't paperwork anymore. This was becoming irreversibly, publicly real. I texted the photo to Priya, who added it immediately to the growing file. "This is good," she said, which felt like an odd thing to say about something that made my hands shake. Until she explained, invitations meant guests, meant witnesses, meant an audience for whatever happened next in that yard. Callie flew back for a final dress fitting 2 weeks before the date. And we sat on my back porch that night looking at the flower beds Patricia's people had trampled setting up string lights. "She's decorating your revenge for you," Callie said quietly. And for the first time in weeks, we both laughed. Patricia called me directly that week, oddly warm, asking if I'd be willing to step back gracefully on the day itself, perhaps stay with a friend so the showcase could run smoothly. I told her I wouldn't dream of missing it. She took that as agreement. It was, in fact, promise. I spent that final stretch quietly reinforcing the case with Priya, organizing every email, every photo, every mismatched receipt into a single timeline, clean and undeniable. Priya said the file was strong enough now to bring not just an HOA complaint but potentially a civil trespass claim, and possibly fraud allegations. Fraud, Priya explained, because the fabricated bylaw and forged authority weren't just rude. They were Patricia representing false legal power to justify using someone else's property and someone else's association funds. In a state that took HOA overreach seriously, that combination could mean real, lasting consequences for her. I asked what lasting consequences might look like. Priya said removal from the board was almost certain once the facts came out, and depending on how the state regulator responded, possible personal liability for the misused funds, meaning Patricia herself, not the HOA, might have to repay every improperly authorized dollar. Callie, when I told her this, smiled in a way I hadn't seen since her first engagement fell apart years earlier. Not gleeful exactly, but deeply, quietly satisfied, like something long owed was finally coming due. "Good," she said. "Let her pay for the flowers she stole from us in every sense." The days blurred together after that. Final dress steaming, seating charts, phone calls with the backup venue confirming logistics, all while Patricia's crew kept building in my backyard, unaware they were constructing the exact stage on which their own downfall would play out in front of the whole neighborhood. One afternoon I found Tyler, Brooke's fiancé, standing alone by the half-built arbor, staring at it like he didn't fully recognize what he was looking at. "This is your land, isn't it?" he said, not really asking. I told him the truth, said nothing else, and walked away troubled. That encounter stayed with me. Tyler clearly hadn't been fully looped into whatever Patricia had told Brooke, and I found myself hoping, quietly, that when everything came apart, it wouldn't cost him and Brooke more than it should. My fight was with Patricia. I didn't want collateral damage among the innocent. Priya filed the formal complaint with the state's HOA Oversight Office 10 days before the wedding date, timed deliberately so an investigator's inquiry letter would land in Patricia's mailbox right around the final week of preparations. Close enough to rattle her, not close enough to stop the coming collision entirely. Patricia mentioned nothing of any letter when I saw her next, though something in her posture had changed. Tighter, faster, less performatively warm. Renata reported that Patricia had snapped at a board member during a routine call, an uncharacteristic crack in the relentless cheerfulness she usually wore like a uniform. I began quietly informing a few trusted neighbors, people who'd shared their own stories of Patricia's overreach, that something significant was going to happen at the showcase. I didn't explain details. I simply suggested, casually, that it might be worth being nearby that Saturday if they wanted to see it unfold. Word moves fast in a neighborhood built on shared driveways and thin fences. By the week of the wedding, I suspected half of Cedar Hollow knew something was coming, even if none of them knew exactly what. Patricia, oblivious as ever, mistook the buzz for excitement about her showcase. 5 days out, the Excavator company called to confirm my booking. A small local outfit I'd hired weeks earlier under the vague explanation of yard regrading. Paid in full, scheduled for the Saturday of the wedding. Arrival time set precisely for 2 hours after the ceremony's planned start. Priya reviewed my property lines with a surveyor of our own, a real one. Licensed. Thorough. Confirming beyond any doubt that the entire showcase footprint sat squarely within my legal boundary, with zero shared easement of any kind, visual or otherwise. Patricia's invented clause collapsed under an actual measuring tape. Callie's real dress arrived that week. Ivory lace. Nothing like the sample Brooke had shown around, insisting it matched some vision Patricia had for cohesive showcase aesthetics. 2 brides. 1 yard. 1 date. And only one of them had actually asked permission to be there. I hung Callie's dress in my closet. Waiting. I slept badly that final week. Not from fear but from a strange, coiled anticipation, like standing at the top of a hill about to let a boulder go. Every stake, every receipt, every fabricated clause had built toward this one Saturday. I just had to hold steady until the moment arrived. Patricia called the night before, chipper, asking if I could keep Biscuit inside during the ceremony so the dog wouldn't disrupt photos. I told her Biscuit would absolutely stay out of the way. It was technically true. I simply didn't mention what else would be arriving shortly after those photos were taken. That night Callie and I sat together on the porch steps looking out at the finished arbor. The string lights, the rented dance floor gleaming under a temporary spotlight Patricia's crew had installed. "It's actually beautiful," Callie admitted quietly.
Shame it's about to become.
The days leading directly into the wedding weekend went strangely quiet. Patricia stopped calling, stopped visiting, apparently satisfied that everything was locked into place and I'd accepted my role as silent backdrop. For the first time in months, nobody stood on my lawn measuring anything. Felt almost peaceful, almost eerie. I used the lull to double-check every logistical thread, the Excavator company's confirmed arrival window, the backup venue's readiness for Callie's actual ceremony, Priya's assurance that our documentation was airtight and filed properly with the state office, the time-stamped folder of evidence sitting safely backed up in 3 separate places. Renata brought over banana bread one afternoon, ostensibly neighborly, actually curious. "Is it really happening?" she asked, meaning the plan, not the wedding. I just smiled and said we'd see. She squeezed my hand on her way out and told me half the street was rooting for me. Quietly, from behind their blinds. Priya called that Thursday with news. The state HOA office had responded to her complaint, requesting Patricia produce the original bylaw and board vote records within 30 days. It wouldn't stop Saturday, but it meant an official clock was now ticking, independent of anything we did ourselves that weekend. Callie arrived Friday night with her dress, her mother, and a suitcase of nerves she hid well. Sitting at my kitchen table, she asked one more time if I was completely sure about the timing. I told her yes. Exactly this Saturday. It was finally, almost, here. Patricia sent one final email that Friday evening. CSNG the whole board, thanking everyone for coming together as a community and specifically praising my generosity in hosting. I read it standing in my kitchen, Callie beside me, and felt the last flicker of hesitation in me finally burn away completely. That night I walked the yard alone with a flashlight, checking the arbor Patricia's crew had reinforced. The dance floor bolted into my lawn. The lighting rig wired into my shed's outlet without a single permit. Every unauthorized addition was one more nail in the case Priya had built against her. I texted the excavator company one last time to confirm. The foreman, a patient man named Ruben who'd asked exactly 0 questions when I explained the job, replied simply, "We'll be there at 2 sharp, ma'am," 2 hours after the ceremony was set to begin. Exactly as planned, down to the minute. Callie's mother, visiting from Ohio, kept glancing nervously between the beautiful setup in the yard and her daughter's calm, unreadable face, clearly sensing something neither of us had fully explained. "It's under control, Mom," Callie said, and left it there. Some things were easier shown than told in advance. I laid out my own outfit for Saturday with unusual care. Not for Patricia's showcase, but for the moment after, when I'd need to stand in front of a hijack ceremony and a bulldozer and speak clearly, calmly, without a single tremor in my voice giving away how long this had been building. Renata called Friday night to say she'd be watching from her porch with a pair of binoculars and, in her words, "The popcorn already popped." I laughed for the first time all week. A real laugh. The kind that unclenches something in your chest you didn't realize had been tight for months. Priya sent a final message confirming she'd personally be present Saturday afternoon. Not as a guest but as legal counsel, ready to speak with any board members or officials who needed to hear, directly and immediately, exactly why what Patricia had orchestrated constituted trespass, fraud, and fabricated authority. I barely slept that final night, running through the sequence again and again. Ceremony begins, guests seated, Patricia basking in her triumph. And then, precisely on schedule, the low growl of heavy machinery arriving at the curb, right as she stood at her most publicly, unshakably confident. Callie slept better than I did, oddly calm in the guest room down the hall, her dress hanging ready on the closet door. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking of every stake pulled from the lawn, every fabricated clause, every family who'd moved rather than fight Patricia Vance. By dawn on Saturday, the yard looked genuinely stunning. String lights glowing faintly against the early light, the arbor draped in white fabric, chairs arranged in neat rows facing a stage that had been built entirely on land that was never Patricia's to use. The countdown had finally reached 0. Patricia arrived at 7 a.m. Sharp, clipboard in hand, directing florists and a string quartet like a general on a battlefield she believed was entirely hers. She barely glanced at me on the porch, tossing out a cheerful big day, as though I were merely a helpful neighbor lending a lawn. By 9, cars began lining the street, guests I didn't recognize, dressed for a wedding that had nothing to do with my sister, filing through my side gate under Patricia's direction like she'd personally built the property from the ground up. Nobody asked whose house it actually was. Callie stayed hidden upstairs with her mother and her real dress, watching through the curtains as strangers filled folding chairs meant, on paper, for nobody Patricia had ever formally invited to use this land. "It's surreal," Callie whispered, watching her hang herself in real time and not even knowing it. Brooke arrived at 10 in a robe, hair half done, nerves visible even from a distance. She caught my eye once across the yard and gave a small, apologetic wave, like some part of her understood this wasn't entirely right, even if she didn't yet grasp exactly how wrong it was. Tyler found me by the fence around 10:30, dressed but tie still loose, and asked quietly if I was really okay with all this. I told him, honestly, that everything was going to be fine, for him and Brooke specifically, if not for the person who'd built this day on stolen ground. Patricia intercepted our conversation, steering Tyler away with a bright laugh about groom's jitters, clearly uncomfortable seeing him talk to me directly. I noticed, not for the first time, how carefully she managed who spoke to whom, controlling information the way she controlled everything else in Cedar Hollow. By 11, the quartet was tuning, the caterers plating appetizers on tables set squarely atop my flower beds, and Patricia stood near the arbor practically vibrating with pride, accepting compliments from guests about the gorgeous community initiative, as though she'd personally grown every flower with her own 2 hands. I watched Ruben's Excavator company truck idle 2 streets over, out of sight, exactly where I'd asked him to wait until my signal. He'd texted at 11:15, "Standing by." I texted back a single thumbs up, my hand steadier than I expected given everything riding on the next 3 hours. Priya arrived at 11:30, dressed unassumingly, blending into the crowd of guests near the back row, a folder tucked discreetly under her arm containing every piece of evidence we gathered, the forged clause, the single signature receipts, the emails, the photos, months of Patricia's own words condemning her. At noon, the ceremony began. Brooke walked down an aisle built on my patio stones, past chairs arranged in my grass, toward an arbor constructed with materials paid for through misappropriated HOA funds, while Patricia stood beaming in the front row like the true architect of the entire beautiful scene. I stood at the very back, near the gate, Biscuit leashed quietly beside me, watching the ceremony unfold with a strange, hollow calm. It was, genuinely, a lovely wedding, soft vows, a string quartet, real love between Brooke and Tyler. None of that was the problem. The theft was the problem. Halfway through the vows, my phone buzzed once. Ruben, checking in. I glanced at the officiant's pace, the guest list, the sun climbing toward 2 o'clock, and calculated we were still on schedule. Everything Patricia had built would stand exactly long enough to matter, and not 1 minute longer. The ceremony ended just after 12:30 to warm applause. Brooke and Tyler kissing beneath an arbor. Callie had originally chosen fabric samples for months earlier. Patricia clapped loudest of anyone, already directing guests toward the reception tables, already accepting a toast someone offered to the woman who made this all possible. I slipped away during the applause to check my phone. Priya had texted, "Board members here are asking questions about the fund transfers already. 2 are getting nervous." Small cracks were forming even before the main event. Patricia's confidence, turned out, was resting on far less than she believed. Reception moved quickly into toasts, the string quartet shifting to lighter music, waitstaff circulating with champagne paid for out-of-community dues nobody had voted to spend that way. Patricia took the microphone briefly, thanking generous neighbors without once using my name, exactly as she'd erased me from every invitation before. I checked the time, 1:40. 20 minutes until Ruben's crew arrived. I found Callie upstairs, dressed now in her real gown, calm and radiant, watching the reception below through the window like a queen surveying a kingdom about to change hands. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded. At 1:55, I walked out onto the porch in full view of the reception. Callie a step behind me in her wedding dress, and the shift in the crowd was immediate. Confused glances, a ripple of whispered questions about who the second bride standing among them actually was. Patricia spotted us first, her smile faltering for the briefest second before she recovered, striding over with practiced cheer. "Dana, Callie, so glad you could join us informally," she said loudly, clearly hoping to fold our presence into her narrative before anyone asked an inconvenient question about it. I didn't raise my voice, clearly enough for nearby guests to hear. "This is my sister's wedding date, on my land, and neither of us gave permission for any of this." A hush spread outward from us like a stone dropped in still water, guest by guest, table by table. Patricia laughed too loudly, calling it a little mix-up we can discuss later, reaching for my arm to steer me away from earshot. I stepped back and said, evenly, "There's nothing to discuss later. There's only what's about to happen right now." Her hand froze midair, confusion flickering across her face. That's when the low rumble of an engine reached the yard from the street. Distant but unmistakable, growing steadily louder. Heads turned toward the driveway. Patricia's face shifted from confusion to something sharper, something close to fear, as she realized whatever was arriving had not been part of her plan. Ruben's excavator rolled through my gate at exactly 2 o'clock. Right on schedule, tires crunching gravel, guests scattering from its path with startled cries. Patricia ran toward it screaming for it to stop, waving her clipboard like a weapon, as though paperwork had ever once actually protected her from anything. I walked calmly toward the machine, Callie beside me in her wedding dress, and held up a hand to Ruben, who nodded and eased the excavator to a controlled stop a few feet from the arbor. Engine idling, waiting for my word rather than Patricia's frantic, useless commands. "This is private property," I announced to the stunned crowd, loud enough for everyone to hear clearly over the idling engine. "Mine. Not Patricia's niece's. Mine. I never gave permission for any wedding here, and I have the paperwork proving Patricia fabricated the authority to claim otherwise." Patricia spun toward the guests, insisting shrilly that I was lying, that the community had voted, that Clause 14.3 clearly authorized the event. "There is no Clause 14.3, I said, holding up a printed copy of the covenants Priya had brought exactly for this moment. "Your own bylaws stop at 12. A murmur rippled through the crowd as several board members present exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a quiet man named Frank who'd emailed me weeks earlier denying any vote, stepped forward and said, loud enough to matter, "She's right. We never voted on this." I have no idea where that clause came from. Patricia's composure cracked visibly, her voice rising into something closer to panic than authority. "You're all overreacting," she snapped at Frank, at the guests, and me, at anyone within reach. I built this whole beautiful event for this community, and this is the thanks I get. Nobody answered her. Priya stepped forward then, calm and precise, introducing herself to the stunned crowd as legal counsel and holding up the folder she'd carried in quietly all afternoon. I have documentation, she said, of fabricated bylaws, unauthorized use of private property, and HOA funds spent without proper board approval. Patricia lunged for the folder, and Priya simply stepped back, unbothered, tucking it against her chest. This isn't a negotiation, Priya said evenly. This is a formal complaint already filed with the state HOA regulatory office, which has already requested records you apparently cannot produce, because they don't exist. A guest near the front, a woman I didn't recognize, called out asking if this meant the wedding itself was somehow invalid. I shook my head immediately. Brooke and Tyler's marriage is completely real and completely theirs, I said.
The only thing fake here is Patricia.
Brooke pushed through the crowd toward her aunt, mascara already streaking, voice trembling with a mixture of humiliation and fury. You told me this was donated, she said. You told me the owner offered. You told everyone that. Patricia opened her mouth, found nothing true to say, and closed it again. Tyler put a steadying hand on Brooke's shoulder and turned to me, apologizing quietly, genuinely, for something that clearly wasn't his fault. I told him there was nothing to apologize for. His wedding was beautiful. His marriage was real. And none of this was aimed at either of them at all. Patricia tried one last gambit, spinning to the crowd with forced brightness. This is clearly a personal vendetta, she announced. Dana has never liked how this community runs, and she's using my niece's special day to air a grudge. A few guests actually nodded, still loyal to 11 years of habit. Frank, the board member, spoke again, louder this time. Patricia, I have 3 emails from you referencing clause 14.3. I've read our covenants twice this week. That clause does not exist. You wrote it yourself. Recalculating everything they thought they just watched unfold. Someone in the back, I never learned who, called out, "What about the fund? Where'd the money for all this come from?" Patricia's face went a shade paler. Priya answered instead, calmly, holding up a photographed receipt. Single signature. Repeated pattern. Going back years. It seems. Years, Frank repeated, turning fully toward Patricia now, all pretense of collegiality gone from his voice. How many years? Patricia opened her mouth to deflect again, but nothing came out this time. For the first time since I'd met her, Patricia Vance had genuinely, visibly, nothing left to say. Renata, watching from just beyond the fence line with her promised binoculars now dangling forgotten around her neck, stepped forward into the yard itself, unable to resist. "The Ostrowskis," she said loudly. "Ask her about the Ostrowskis' driveway. Ask her how many families she's done this to over the years." More voices rose then. Neighbors I recognized from years of quiet compliance suddenly finding words for grievances they'd swallowed for over a decade. A fined gnome. A repainted shutter. A driveway commandeered. A garden torn out over an invented setback rule. Patricia stood at the center of it all, shrinking visibly. I raised my hand for quiet, and remarkably, the crowd settled. "This isn't about ruining a wedding," I said, looking directly at Brooke. "It's about a woman who's spent 11 years deciding other people's property belongs to her whenever it's convenient. And today she finally ran out of property to take." Reuben, still patiently idling in the excavator, called over the engine noise asking if I still wanted him to proceed. I looked at the reception tables, the guests now clustered safely toward the house. The arbor standing empty since the ceremony had already concluded before any of this began. "Give us 20 minutes, I called back to Reuben. "Let people gather their things." He nodded, cutting the engine to idle low, patient as ever. I turned back to Patricia, who stood frozen near the arbor, clipboard finally, uselessly, hanging at her side like a prop from a play that had ended. "You have 20 minutes to remove anything you value from my backyard," I told her directly. "After that, everything still standing here that wasn't approved by me gets cleared. That includes the dance floor, the lighting rig, and the arbor your niece stood under, which I built for my sister, not for Brooke." Patricia's eyes flicked toward the arbor, understanding dawning slowly that even the structure she'd claimed credit for hadn't been hers to claim at all. Callie, standing beside me in her wedding dress this entire time, finally spoke directly to Patricia. "That's mine," she said simply.
It was all...
Someone actually laughed at that. A short, disbelieving bark from somewhere in the crowd, and the laugh seemed to break something in the tension. Guests shifting from shock into something closer to grim amusement at watching Patricia Vance's 11-year reign collapse in real time over folding chairs and string lights. Brooke, still crying but steadier now, turned to me directly. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I really thought this was donated. I would never have agreed to this if I'd known." I believed her completely. Whatever fury I carried for Patricia had never once extended to the niece she'd used as cover. "Your marriage is real," I told her again, gently this time. "Nothing that happens to this yard in the next 20 minutes changes that. Go celebrate with your husband somewhere that isn't a demolition site." Tyler put his arm around her and steered her gently toward the gate, away from the wreckage building. Patricia, meanwhile, had turned frantic, calling someone on her phone. The police turned out, claiming an unauthorized demolition was about to occur on community property. 2 officers arrived 12 minutes later to a yard full of confused wedding guests and one very calm, very prepared homeowner holding a deed. I showed the responding officers my property deed, my recent survey, and Priya introduced herself as legal counsel, explaining clearly that this was private land, that no crime was occurring, and that the woman making the complaint had, in fact, been operating an unauthorized event on the property for months. The officers exchanged a look, clearly recognizing Patricia's name, apparently not their first call involving Cedar Hollow's HOA president. One of them, older, faintly amused, told Patricia flatly that removing equipment from private land at the owner's direction wasn't a crime, and suggested she consult an attorney of her own. Patricia's second gambit collapsed as quickly as her first, and something in her posture finally broke entirely, shoulders dropping, voice losing its practiced brightness, replaced by something closer to genuine panic as she watched 20 minutes tick steadily down toward the machine still idling at the edge of her stolen stage. Guests began quietly gathering belongings, several stopping to shake my hand or Callie's on their way out, a few even apologizing for having attended without asking whose yard it actually was. Frank stayed behind, phone out, already drafting an emergency board meeting notice for that very evening. At the 15-minute mark, the caterers began breaking down their tables without needing to be asked twice, clearly having sensed which way the wind had turned. The string quartet packed their instruments in record time. Even the rented dance floor company sent someone scrambling to retrieve their equipment before it met the excavator. Patricia made one final attempt, gripping my arm this time, voice low and pleading in a register I'd never once heard from her. "Please, Dana. People are watching." As to my reputation. I looked at her steadily and said, "You should have thought of that 11 years ago." At exactly 2:20, with the yard finally cleared of guests and anything Patricia had bothered to reclaim, I nodded to Reuben. The excavator's engine rose from idle to a full, deliberate growl, and the bucket lifted toward the arbor that had stood, uninvited, at the center of this entire ordeal. The bucket came down on the arbor first, splintering the reclaimed cedar Patricia's crew had reinforced without my consent, the white fabric draping tearing free and drifting across the lawn like something surrendering. Patricia let out a sound I can only describe as a wounded, disbelieving gasp. She lunged toward the machine itself, and Reuben, well-trained and unbothered, simply paused the bucket mid-swing until an officer stepped in front of her. Hand raised, voice firm. "Ma'am, step back. This is private property and the owner has every right to clear it." Patricia stumbled backward, undone. The dance floor went next, wooden panels cracking under the bucket's weight, the temporary lighting rig collapsing in a shower of sparks as its wiring, installed without a single permit, finally gave way. Guests who'd lingered near the gate to watch flinched. Then, unmistakably, a few of them cheered. Patricia turned on the crowd then, shrill and desperate, insisting this was vandalism, that she'd sue every single person watching for standing by while her community investment was destroyed. Frank, still typing his emergency meeting notice, didn't even look up. "It's her land, Patricia," he said. "It was never yours to invest in." I stood beside Callie, still in her wedding dress, watching the last of Patricia's fabricated showcase crumble into splinters and torn fabric across what remained. Underneath it all, my actual patio stones, the ones I'd laid myself, the ones meant for my sister's real ceremony, finally visible again. Renata appeared at my side, phone raised, recording the whole scene for what she cheerfully admitted would become the most watched post the Cedar Hollow Neighborhood Facebook group had ever seen. "This is going in the newsletter too," she said. "The real one. Been getting all along." Patricia's phone rang twice more during the demolition. Brooke, I assumed, or perhaps a board member, and she ignored both calls, standing frozen at the edge of her collapsed showcase as if refusing to look away might somehow reverse what was happening in front of 30 witnesses and 2 police officers. Within 30 minutes, the yard looked less like a construction site and more like the aftermath of a storm. Splintered wood, torn lighting cable, crushed floral centerpieces scattered across trampled grass. Reuben cut the engine, stepped down, and asked simply if I wanted the debris hauled off that same afternoon. I told him yes, as fast as possible, because in a few hours I intended to have an actual wedding on that same patio. And I didn't want a single splinter of Patricia's fraud left behind to mar it. Reuben grinned, said his crew could clear it within 2 hours, and got to work. Frank approached me as the cleanup crew moved in, phone still in hand, and told me the emergency board meeting was set for 7 that evening, at the community clubhouse, open to all residents. "You should come," he said.
"And bring whatever documentation you're
Priya nodded when I relayed this, already anticipating it. "This is exactly what we wanted," she said. "A public meeting. Full documentation. No room left for Patricia to spin a version where she's the victim." I felt, for the first time in months, like the ground beneath me was finally solid. Patricia disappeared sometime during the cleanup, slipping away without a word, leaving Brooke to gather the last of her things with Tyler's help. Both of them subdued but no longer entirely broken by the day. Brooke hugged me, unexpectedly, before leaving. "I'm still getting married," she said.
just not stealing."
By 4 o'clock, Reuben's crew had hauled away every splinter of the collapsed showcase, and my landscaping crew friends I'd called in a favor from arrived to reset the patio, rest-ring the actual lights Callie and I had chosen months earlier, and stand a simple new arbor exactly where the old one had fallen. Callie changed briefly into comfortable clothes to help direct the reset, laughing more freely than she had in weeks, occasionally glancing toward the gate as though still expecting Patricia to reappear with another clipboard and another invented clause. She never did. Not for a long while after. By 6, the yard looked, remarkably, like the wedding we'd planned all along, smaller than Patricia's inflated showcase, quieter, entirely ours, string lights glowing gold against the early evening sky, the real arbor standing exactly where I'd first imagined it 3 years earlier while designing this yard from scratch. Our actual guest list arrived around 6:30, small and warm, close family and true friends who'd known about the real plan from the start, none of them requiring convincing about whose day this truly was. Callie's mother cried twice before the ceremony even began, overwhelmed by how the day had turned. The ceremony itself was simple and true, no fabricated clause, no forged authority, no stolen materials, just Callie and her fiancé Marcus exchanging vows. Beneath cedar I'd built with my own hands, on land that had always, legitimately, unquestionably belonged to me, exactly as it should have from the beginning. I gave a short toast afterward, raising a glass to my sister, to the strange detour her wedding day had taken, and to the fact that sometimes the best revenge wasn't loud or dramatic at all. It was simply reclaiming, calmly and completely, what had always rightfully been yours. While our small reception continued, Priya slipped away briefly to attend the emergency board meeting starting across the neighborhood, promising to fill me in fully once our own celebration wound down. I trusted her completely to represent everything we'd built over the past months in that meeting room. The clubhouse meeting, Priya told me later, had drawn nearly 40 residents, more than any HOA gathering in Cedar Hollow's history, most of them having heard some version of the afternoon's events already circulating through group chats and Renata's freshly posted video, which had, by evening, gathered thousands of views. Frank opened the meeting by reading aloud the exact language of the fictitious clause 14.3 alongside the real covenants, letting the gap between them speak for itself. Patricia, present but visibly shaken, tried once more to claim a misunderstanding, insisting the language had been informally agreed upon years earlier. Priya stood then, calm and thorough, presenting the timeline she'd built, the fabricated clause, the unauthorized property entry, the single signature expenditures, the pattern of similar incidents involving at least 4 other families going back nearly a decade, including the Ostrowski's driveway Renata had first mentioned months earlier. A woman I didn't know, introduced as a former board treasurer who'd resigned 3 years prior, stood and confirmed she'd raised concerns about single signature spending back then and had been quietly pushed off the board for asking too many questions. The pattern went back even further than we'd realized. By the time public comment opened, the room had turned entirely against Patricia, residents standing one after another to describe fines over garden gnomes, forced repainting, a driveway taken for a fundraiser, and now, most dramatically, an entire wedding staged on stolen land using misappropriated community funds. The board called for an emergency vote on Patricia's removal as president, a measure that required, per the actual bylaws Priya had made everyone finally read carefully, only a simple majority of board members present. The vote passed unanimously, 5-0, with Patricia herself abstaining in stony silence. Frank was appointed interim president on the spot, and immediately announced a full independent audit of HOA finances going back 5 years, specifically flagging every expenditure that lacked proper dual signatures. A list, it would turn out over the following weeks, considerably longer than anyone had anticipated. Priya texted me the outcome just as our own reception was winding down, guests lingering over cake beneath the string lights. I read it twice, standing beside Callie, and felt something settle in my chest that had been clenched tight since the first strange email about a showcase months before. Callie hugged me hard when I told her, still in her dress, cake fork forgotten in one hand. "It's really over," she said, not quite believing it. I told her it wasn't quite over yet. There was still the audit, still whatever consequences might follow. But the worst of it, undeniably, was the following Monday. The audit's early findings began circulating informally among board members before the official report was even finished. And what surfaced painted a picture far worse than a single fabricated clause or one unauthorized wedding, years of small, quiet, single signature withdrawals nobody had ever properly questioned. Renata's video, meanwhile, had spread well beyond Cedar Hollow, picked up by a local news outlet doing a segment on HOA overreach, using our story without naming us directly, at Priya's careful request, as an example of exactly the kind of unchecked authority state regulators had been warning about for years. Patricia stopped appearing at neighborhood functions entirely, her once constant presence at every mailbox and driveway suddenly, conspicuously absent. Frank mentioned she'd sent a brief, terse email resigning her remaining board seat entirely rather than face the audit's conclusions in person at the next scheduled meeting. The independent auditors, working through weeks of receipts, eventually traced just over $11,000 in questionable single-signature expenditures over 4 years, catering, decor, a beautification consultant, who turned out to be a friend of Patricia's, paid in cash for work nobody could actually verify had occurred. Priya explained that the state HOA regulatory office, having already received our original complaint, now had grounds to pursue Patricia for both the fabricated bylaw, and the broader financial pattern, potentially resulting in personal liability for repayment of every improperly authorized dollar the audit had uncovered. Brooke called me unexpectedly one evening in early November, voice careful, thanking me for how I'd handled everything despite having every reason not to. "I didn't know what she'd done," she said again. "I keep thinking about all those other families." I told her she didn't owe me an apology. Patricia did. Tyler and Brooke, I learned through Renata's grapevine, had quietly held a small second ceremony of their own weeks later, at a real venue they'd booked and paid for themselves, determined to have at least one wedding memory untouched by Patricia's fabrications. I was glad, genuinely, to hear it. The Ostrowskis, whose driveway story had first tipped Renata off months earlier, reached out through a mutual friend once word of the audit spread, asking whether they might have grounds to pursue their own claim for the fundraiser Patricia had staged on their property years before without any real authorization. Priya connected the Ostrowskis with the same state regulatory office already investigating Patricia, and within weeks their case joined ours, along with two other families who came forward once the story spread, one over a rejected fence, another over a mailbox Patricia had personally, illegally, removed years earlier. By late November, Patricia faced not just removal from the board but a formal state investigation into repeated bylaw fabrication across multiple properties, plus mounting pressure from the HOA's own attorney to settle the financial discrepancies quietly before the matter escalated into something with her name attached in local news. I learned through Frank that Patricia had hired her own lawyer, a tired-sounding man who reportedly spent most of one meeting simply asking her, repeatedly, why she'd put so much of this in writing. Emails, texts, a newsletter with my name on an event I'd never approved. She documented her own downfall. The twist that surprised even me came in early December, when the audit uncovered that the beautification consultant paid in cash over those 4 years was, in fact, Patricia's brother-in-law, a man with no landscaping or event experience whatsoever, meaning the funds had likely gone straight back into her own family's pocket. Frank called an all-resident meeting to present the completed audit, and the room, once again, filled beyond capacity, this time with Patricia noticeably absent, her attorney having advised her against appearing anywhere the findings might be discussed publicly while a settlement remained under negotiation with the association. The board voted to pursue full restitution for the $11,000 identified, plus additional smaller sums still being traced, and to refer the fabricated, bylaw and unauthorized property use specifically involving my land to the state regulator as a separate, more serious complaint, given the scale of documented harm. Callie, by then back home in Ohio settling into married life, called regularly for updates, half amused and half amazed at how thoroughly one stolen wedding date had unraveled 11 years of quiet, unchecked control. "You didn't just win," she said once. "You basically audited her entire reign." I hadn't set out to expose years of financial misconduct. I'd only wanted my sister's wedding date back. But Patricia's own overreach, her own paper trail, her own willingness to fabricate authority in writing again and again, had done far more damage to herself than anything I could have engineered alone. By mid-December, Patricia agreed to a settlement requiring full restitution of the misappropriated funds, a permanent ban from ever serving on the Cedar Hollow HOA board again, and a formal written apology to every affected family, including mine, acknowledging the fabricated clause and unauthorized use of my property. Reading that apology, stiff and clearly drafted by lawyers rather than felt, gave me less satisfaction than I expected. The real satisfaction had already happened months earlier. Standing in my own backyard in my sister's wedding dress, watching an excavator dismantle a stage built on someone else's stolen confidence. The neighborhood itself changed noticeably in the aftermath. Frank, as interim president, pushed through new rules requiring dual signatures on every expenditure without exception, recorded votes for any community event using private property, and a published, searchable copy of the actual covenants sent to every household that January. Renata's video, still circulating months later, had turned Cedar Hollow into a minor cautionary tale among HOA circles online, prompting messages from strangers in other states asking for advice after recognizing eerily similar patterns in their own communities: fabricated clauses, unauthorized property use, Karen just like ours. I found myself, unexpectedly, fielding some of those messages myself, offering the same advice Priya had given me back in September. Document everything, involve an actual attorney early, and never assume silence from an overreaching board member means the matter has quietly, safely gone away on its own. My landscaping business, oddly, benefited from the whole ordeal. Several new clients specifically mentioned having seen Renata's video and wanting a yard worth defending. As one put it, half joking, I tried not to build my professional reputation on a bulldozer, but I wasn't above accepting the referrals. Brooke reached out again in January, this time inviting me to coffee, something I hadn't expected but agreed to readily. We talked for over an hour, mostly about how strange it felt discovering someone you trusted completely had used you as cover for something you'd never have agreed to knowingly. I keep replaying every conversation with her, Brooke admitted, stirring a cooling coffee she hadn't touched, looking for the moments I should have asked more questions. I told her what Priya had told me once, that people like Patricia count precisely on people not asking, and that isn't Brooke's failing. This Patricia's design. By February, the settlement had been finalized, restitution paid in installments, and Patricia had put her house on the market. No longer, apparently, able to stand living somewhere every neighbor now knew exactly what she'd done. Renata reported the sign went up on a Tuesday and the house sold within 3 weeks. I didn't feel triumphant watching the moving truck pull away that March, more than half a year after the first strange email about a showcase. I felt, mostly, relief, the specific, quiet relief of watching a long, exhausting fight finally, completely, conclude without needing to be refought ever again. Frank, still serving as president, called occasionally that spring just to check in, half business and half genuine friendliness, something Patricia had never once extended toward me in 3 years as my neighbor. Cedar Hollow, without her at the center of it, felt smaller, quieter, considerably easier to actually live in. Callie and Marcus visited again in April, walking the yard together, the real arbor now weathered and settled into the landscape like it had always belonged there. String lights rest-rung permanently overhead. Best decision you ever made, Callie said, letting her build the whole thing before you tore it down. I laughed, because she was right in a way I hadn't fully appreciated until months later. Every dollar Patricia spent, every hour she invested convincing herself she'd won, had only made her collapse more complete, more public, more undeniable than any confrontation in September could have managed alone. Priya and I stayed in touch well past the settlement, occasionally grabbing dinner to catch up, and she mentioned once that our case had become something of a reference point for her firm, proof that patience, documentation, and a well-timed excavator could accomplish what confrontation alone almost never does. The State Regulatory Office, in its final report, cited our complaint specifically as contributing to new proposed guidance for HOA boards statewide, requiring clearer processes for property use authorization and stricter auditing of single-signature expenditures. A small, unglamorous legacy, but a real one nonetheless. I planted new flower beds that spring exactly where Patricia's caterers had trampled the old ones the previous fall, choosing perennials this time, things that would come back reliably every year regardless of what chaos briefly passed through. Felt like a fitting, quiet metaphor I never said out loud to anyone. Renata and I grew closer through the whole ordeal, our fence-line conversations evolving into regular dinners, her running commentary on neighborhood happenings, now delivered with considerably more relish since Patricia's departure, had opened up an entire new category of harmless, genuinely funny HOA gossip to share. By summer, Cedar Hollow held its actual annual fall social planning meeting 9 months early, this time with a proper vote, proper minutes, and volunteers offering their yards freely rather than having one selected unilaterally by whoever happened to hold the most institutional confidence and the least accountability. I offered my backyard again, this time genuinely, this time asked, this time voted on transparently by residents who actually wanted to be there. Watching the vote pass unanimously, string lights already half installed from Callie's wedding still glowing faintly in my memory, felt like closing a loop months in the making. Brooke and Tyler attended that fall social together, their first anniversary approaching, and Brooke found me near the drink table to say, simply, that she was glad the yard finally got to host something everyone had actually agreed to. It deserves that, she said.
After everything,
I thought, standing in that same yard a year almost to the day after the first strange email, about how close I'd come to simply giving up somewhere in October, exhausted, outmatched, certain a woman with 11 years of institutional armor would simply outlast me the way she'd outlasted everyone before. What had actually saved the outcome wasn't dramatic confrontation but the slow, unglamorous accumulation of proof, every stake photographed, every fabricated email forwarded, every receipt saved before the wind could carry it away. Patricia had been undone, in the end, mostly by her own careless paper trail. Frank mentioned once, near the end of that fall social, that the association's insurance carrier had flagged Patricia's case internally, using it as a training example for other HOA boards about liability exposure when a president operates unilaterally without proper authorization. An unglamorous footnote, but a lasting one. Callie called that night after the party, curious how it had gone, and I told her honestly it had felt almost anticlimactic in the best possible way. A quiet, well-attended community gathering, nothing fabricated, nothing stolen, everyone exactly where they'd chosen to be of their own free will. That's the real win, Callie said. Not the bulldozer. Normal Tuesday afternoon meeting where everyone just follows the actual rules. I agreed, though I privately admitted the bulldozer moment would probably remain, forever, the single most satisfying afternoon of my entire adult life regardless. I still have the folder Priya and I built that fall. Printed and bound now. Sitting in a drawer I rarely open. Sometimes, on a quiet evening, I take it out just to remember how close an ordinary email about a showcase came to becoming something that could have swallowed my sister's wedding entirely. The arbor still stands exactly where I rebuilt it. Cedar weathered gray now. String lights strung fresh each season. Hosting more real gatherings in the 2 years. Since then, Patricia's fabricated showcase ever managed in its brief, spectacular, thoroughly documented existence before the excavator arrived precisely on schedule.